Have you ever wanted to start a podcast, or do you have something that you're really passionate about that you want to tell the world about? That you want to get out there and shout from the rooftop about something that just excites you and envelops you? Well, I'm going to talk about starting a podcast in today's episode. So stick around, grab that cup of brew, and join me as I dive into starting a podcast. Hey everybody, I'm your host, Virginia Jones. I'm the host of this podcast, Purposely Vintage. And as the intro stated, I'm going to be talking to you about how to start a podcast. Now, I had one of my listeners actually ask me this question about doing a podcast on how to start a podcast. So I'm going to share with you my podcast journey. So I started podcasting in October of 2020. And the reason I started a podcast was because my youngest daughter, we have two daughters, and my youngest daughter had graduated from homeschooling in 2016. And so at that point, I've got nothing that I'm doing. I'm like, what do I do with myself, right? How do I fill my time? What am I supposed to do? So I was listening to a podcast, and I believe it was something about legends and myths and stuff like that. I like to listen to like sci-fi, stuff like that. And they had on there an advertisement for a podcast hosting site called Anchor. And they begin to talk about starting a podcast and how easy it was. And I'm like, hey, I can do this. I like to talk to people and stuff like that. So I went on Anchor and I actually started my first podcast. It was called Vintage Lady, I think, or something like that. Something vintage. I can't remember. It's been a few years ago, like I said. And I actually started recording on an iPhone. So I had an old iPhone, and it may have been an Android, but I think it was an iPhone. And I put the Anchor app on there, and I just started to talk. And I began to podcast. And so later on, I moved on to a podcast hosting site called Podbean. Then I had Red, and then I had Buzzsprout, and then I have Substack. So over a period of, several years, this is now my 6th year, it will be in October. Over the many years, I've used different podcast hosting sites. But, I just started small. I just started with a phone and I just started to record. I talked about biblical topics and vintage things, because I'm a Jane Austen fan. So I talked about, teas, and I talked about how to write a letter. I talked about Regency, fashion and things like that. And I actually went on to a site called Podmatch, where you go on there and they find you guests for your podcast. So I actually did quite a few guests over a year or so. I'm no longer on Podmatch only because financially, it just got to the point where it costs a lot. It does cost something if you want to really dive into it and everything, but I'll get into more of that. So, I was doing a weekly podcast episode and I would come up with different topics, like I said, that I wanted to put on there. And then I moved to different things, different hosting sites because I didn't like the way certain things were done. So I tried Podbean and then I tried Buzzsprout and now I'm on Substack. The reason why I'm on Substack now is because I wanted to kind of downsize my finances. I actually do housekeeping for a job, and so I pay for my own subscriptions, I pay for my own equipment, all that stuff. And I was spending a lot of money trying to do a podcast, and it was taking a lot out of me. And so I kind of took a break from it for a few months. And then one of the clients that I cleaned for, her friend was doing podcasting on Substack. And I'm like, huh. So I checked it out. She told me a little bit about it and it was free. And so I am doing it for free right now. And, later on I may change again. Who knows? But right now I'm on Substack. And the reason being is because on Substack, you can also write blogs. You can do like a newsletter. You can do different things with Substack. And so I am not completely familiar with it, but I am learning more about it. So podcasting is really a way for you to talk about, like I said, the things you're passionate about, having that niche that you really get excited about, something that you're knowledgeable about. So, in starting a podcast, I'm going to go down through the different things that you ought to be thinking about in starting a podcast. So, I kind of put these out of order, but I felt like they were kind of in order of the way that I did them. So, I'm just going to share them with you. But the first thing that I wrote down is you need to find your special niche. Now you can have a variety of topics within that niche. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Niche, I don't know. Anywho, you need to have something that you're really passionate about, that you really want to talk about. So for example, I now have a podcast called Purposely Vintage, and I am a vintage soul. I am a person who, my husband says, I was born like 200 years too late. I would have loved to have been during the Regency period. That's my favorite era. The 1860s would have been kind of cool to live through. But I like vintage things. I like history. I love history. I love doing things in a vintage way. And so we have a farm that we have in Central Maine. We have 6 acres, and we are doing that. We are doing things in a holistic way, kind of in a way they used to do things. I mean, we do have modern amenities. I'm not saying that we are completely 100% off grid, but we do like to do things in a more vintage fashion. So, we're doing our farm, we're raising our animals, stuff like that. So I really love things that are vintage. And you need to be knowledgeable, not necessarily just throwing something out there without having your facts, without understanding about the topic that you are talking about. Now, some people say, oh, you should only have just one thing that you talk about. For instance, like if you're talking about sports, you're only talking about sports. If you're talking about finances, you're only talking about maybe one aspect of finances and stuff. I actually had someone comment, and they told me that they really liked the way I did my podcast because, and this was an older podcast I had, because I had a variety of topics on there. However, it kind of revolved around the same like vintagey kind of feel to it. So that's what I'm trying to do with this more newer podcast. It's purposely vintage. So, vintage ways, biblical aspects, things like that. So I want to be keeping around that kind of vibe. And And so to have a variety, I think, is more interesting to have, a little bit of variety in your podcast. Maybe not just stick to one thing that seems repetitive, but you're expanding a little bit on different things you're talking about. And yet you're still keeping in that theme. So another example to kind of give you an idea of what I mean. When we were homeschooling, we would take a certain subject. So, for example, the Civil War. And we would write that on a piece of paper, the word Civil War. And then we did all these little arrows that kind of branched out from that word. What can we study about the Civil War? Their uniforms, their food, how they traveled, the different aspects of, what they felt being in the Civil War, the politics of the day. So you're kind of finding one thing you're really interested about and you're branching out to talk about things that really still revolve around that subject. So if that makes sense, I feel like that's kind of where you should start. So then you really have to figure out, okay, how much time can I really put into this? Now, I will let you know, because I'm keeping it real. I do not always do a weekly podcast episode. There's been a couple of weeks actually where I haven't gotten a podcast episode up. And time, life, things happen, right? And so you can't always get that weekly episode, but you should try to be as consistent as possible in getting a podcast episode up. Maybe not let many weeks go by, but if a week or two goes by, I don't think it's going to hurt anything. However, if you have months where you don't do a podcast episode, people are going to lose interest, I think, and they're not going to want to be listening to your podcast. So if you ask yourself, how devoted am I to really getting this up? Because it's not just getting behind the mic and talking, but you've also got to do a lot of other things. So also the other thing that you ask yourself, am I going to be a solo or am I going to be a group? Am I going to be in a group of podcasters that are doing one podcast, or am I doing this by myself? Now, in my case, I'm doing this on my own. This is me and myself, right? So I may include my husband at some point. I may have guests on this podcast at some point, but it's pretty much by myself. So it does require, amount of time to be able to put your podcast together. You're editing, you're finding titles, you're writing blogs. Now, I don't write a blog for my podcast. However, being on Substack, I've learned a few things by watching a tutorial on it. So I learned a few things that I should be doing that I'm not doing right now. So I really want to get more technical about my podcast. I don't know if that's really the term that I should use. But I want to get more technical with it. So the next thing that I felt like that I wanted to go over is the equipment. Now, at the beginning, I said that I used an iPhone, and I did. I used an iPhone for several years before I got my my desktop computer, and then I bought myself a mic on an arm so that I could just sit at my desk. And that's what I'm using right now. I'm using a microphone that's attached to an arm, and I'm sitting in my chair, sitting at my desk in front of my desktop computer, and I am speaking through that. I also have a Blue Yeti that I have taken out to the kitchen, and I'll use that attached to my laptop. So there are some things you're going to need if you really want to get serious about podcasting. So you can start with an iPhone or Android. You can get Buzzsprout app on your phone. You can get Audacity, which is what I'm using to record my podcast. And you can get Riverside, I think, on there if you want to use Riverside app to record your podcast. Podbean, I think, has an app that you can get on your phone. So you can use your phone and use the app on your phone to be able to record and edit and things like that. And you can use a laptop, you can use, a small microphone. So you're going to need a mic, either like I have on an arm, or the Blue Yeti. There's Shure mics. I mean, there's all kinds of microphones out there, and it depends upon your budget. So I've had this one for several years, but I think it cost me, I'm gonna say, maybe $75 for the whole thing. I mean, and I've had it for years. I've had it for several years, but it works great. And so if it works, I'm gonna continue to use it. There may be some time when I really do want to upgrade my microphones, and I'm looking at getting some Shure mics that I can put into my studio, because I'm actually recording in my craft room right now. But my youngest daughter has moved out and she's found her own place. So now her room is going to become the studio. And I'm going to move all of my computer equipment and everything into that room. And eventually I want to have it set up so I can actually have a couple of guests that will be sitting and we just chat over coffee. We're just having a conversation. But each of us will have to have a mic. So then at that point, you're going to need an interface. So that is a piece of equipment where you plug in multiple microphones. And you're going to be able to do that so you're not getting the crackling and all the craziness that goes into having one mic and trying to use it with multiple people. That's just not going to work. You need to have individual microphones if you're having more than one person. Again, the editing software, you can have Riverside, there's Audacity. I don't know what other ones are out there, but I use Audacity and I've used them ever since I've had a podcast, and I have found them to be really good. I have a notebook that I have with me, and I have it actually in front of me, where I write some bullet points. I write different, like if I'm doing a Bible topic, I'll write different scriptures that I want to read, different points, direction that I want to go in with my podcast episode. Or you could have an iPad. You could just have whatever you use to write your notes on. And you're going to want something to drink. And the reason why I'm saying that is because as you're talking, your mouth's going to get dry. You're going to be talking, and you're going to start having these moments where you might cough, you might, get a dry mouth, and you're going to have to pause your thing, get a sip of water or something, and then continue on. And so I find that having something next to me that I can sip, I can pause my recording, get a drink of water, get a cup of coffee, and then go back into recording. So looking down through, I'm just making sure I have everything that I can remember that I need. I think that's it. So going on to bullet points, when I do a topic, so let me think. When I did the subject, and I may do that on this podcast, when I did the subject of Regency fashion, I would have certain bullet points, like who was in reign at that time? What were the different fashion designs of the era? What kind of fabrics did they use? And I would write these bullet points that I wanted to talk about, the direction that I wanted to talk about. Who influenced the Regency era? Where did that style and design come from? And different things like that. So you're going to want to do your research that you're going to put into your podcast. Okay, when you do a podcast episode, you're going to have an area of your podcast episode that is going to be for your show notes. So you're going to put in there a short description of your podcast, and then you're going to put any links down. So you might link your social media. You might put links to websites that you went and did your research from, books that you want to bring out for future reading on the subject or topic that you're talking about. And so it's important to list all those, not make it really super long, but, to have a little bit of notes in there where people can find certain things, kind of sum up what you're talking about in your podcast episode. The other thing that I do, now I don't know if everyone does this, but the other thing that I do is I do a trailer. So I do a short trailer, kind of like almost a fish hook. Like, okay, what's this episode going to be about? And it kind of hooks the listener. I'm not perfect at it. I will tell you that right now. I'm not very good at it, but I am learning. And so when they first click on your podcast episode, they're going to hear, oh, yeah, this is what it's going to be about. And it's just like that kind of bait that you're throwing out there to try to hook a listener. And you also want to make sure you have some catchy titles. That's the thing I'm working on with my podcast episodes. When you do a podcast episode, make sure you have a title that's really catchy, that really catches the eye of somebody scrolling through Spotify or Apple Podcasts or things like that. So that's the other thing. When you do a podcast episode, you have your hosting site and you're going to distribute your podcast episode to different places like Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Cast, what else? iTunes. And some hosting sites will automatically do that. Like you put in your URL and they'll just distribute it for you. And so Substack, I think, does that. I just put in my thing and they just distribute it to different sites where people can listen to your podcast. And you want to make sure that you're advertising. I'm not as good at that as I really want to be. And I know I'm talking too fast. So I got to slow down. This is real life, right? I got to slow down. But you do want to try to distribute your podcast to as many places as you can so you can get, more listeners. Those are all things I'm still working on. So I'm not here to say, oh yeah, I'm perfect at this and this is how you do it. I'm just sharing with you, this is what I've done. And again, I'm not perfect. I am still learning, even though I have been in the podcasting world for 6 years and maybe a little bit longer, because I did listen to podcasts before I became a podcaster. So I knew a little bit about it, but even 6 years in, some people have been in for 20 plus years and they still learn new things. So it's not something you're going to perfect overnight, and it is going to take time to build up your audience because nobody knows you, right? So you're new out there and you've got a podcast, you've started a podcast now, and so you're going to have to grow your audience. So, putting reels on Facebook, putting things on Twitter or X, I think they call it X now, putting things on Instagram, being able to distribute and get an audience out there. Now with Substack, you're actually doing it by email. And I do have a link that I have put on my Facebook and my Instagram. But they also have to put an email in there, I think. So every time you do a podcast episode, it comes into their email box and they can see that, oh yeah, she's got a new podcast episode up. So, and they can click on it, go to that podcast and listen to it. Anyway, so, yeah, that is pretty much my podcasting journey, and I'm still learning, but most of all, you want to do those things. You want to go through and make sure you have the right equipment, and you want to be able to get all this stuff together, but most of all, just have fun with it. It should be an enjoyable journey, and when it becomes something that is causing you stress and is causing you a lot of problems, maybe it's time to step back from it. And that's what I had to do for a little bit. I actually canceled, or I don't know, I deleted some of my podcasts that I had before. And I took a step back and it's like, okay, what is it that I'm really doing here? What am I trying to do here? And I had to stop and think about that. And I'm actually thinking about going away for a couple of days in the next few months to just kind of brainstorm and think about the different topics that I want to bring on my podcast, because I really do love podcasting. And when I wasn't podcasting, I missed it terribly, because it's just something, if it's in your heart to do, you're going to miss it when you don't do it. So I really enjoy it. And I met a ton of people over the years that are just amazing people through podcasting. I will eventually have some guests on my podcast again. But for now, it's just solo mio, right? It's just me. Oh, speaking of Solo Mio, if you haven't seen that movie, that is an amazing movie. Please go out and watch it. Or if it's already out of theaters, rent it, get it on DVD. It's a great movie. Anyway, but right now I am solo. I do want to bring my husband on for certain topics, things like that. So we shall see. But anyway, I hope this podcast episode has helped you and encouraged you and kind of sparked you to maybe do a podcast. And again, have fun. Just have fun and enjoy the podcast journey. So thank you so much for just listening to these podcast episodes. Thank you for supporting me. And yeah, go out there and have fun.